On March 11, 2005, Daniel Weller was arrested after an incident at the couple's home. Claire had called 911, whispering through a bloodied lip that Daniel had finally snapped. She claimed he'd struck her multiple times and thrown her against a wall. The emergency operator noted her voice was trembling, scared, but oddly calm. When officers arrived, Claire's injuries were visible. Daniel was found in the garage, sitting on the cold concrete floor, hands bloody, not resisting. He claimed she was lying, that they had fought, yes, but that he never touched her. "She wants out," he said during the interrogation. "She wants me gone, and this is her way out." But the physical evidence, her testimony, and a history of minor domestic complaints were enough to convince a jury. He was sentenced to 20 years for aggravated assault and attempted manslaughter. Claire filed for divorce within weeks of the sentencing. 2 years later, she quietly remarried. Her new husband, Evan Madsen, was a local contractor and father of one to neighbors. They looked happy. Claire never spoke of Daniel again, but in state prison, Daniel remembered every word she said in court. Every tear, every accusation. He counted the years. And in 2025, the door finally opened. Daniel Weller walked out of Green State Correctional Facility on a cold morning in January 2025, clutching a clear plastic bag with the belongings he had entered with. A broken wristwatch, a wallet with $8 inside, and a photo of Claire, faded and curled at the edges. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. Her face was etched into his memory. No one waited for him outside. He didn't expect them to. His parents had died years ago, and he hadn't spoken to anyone from his old life since sentencing. He stepped onto the bus with nothing but a parole folder in his pocket, and the memory of a woman standing on a witness stand, swearing he had tried to kill her. His parole conditions were strict. He was assigned a halfway house in Allegheny County, 80 miles from his old home in Northwood. A caseworker gave him a rundown of rules, a schedule, and a packet of job leads. He nodded, silent. He didn't argue. He didn't draw attention. But inside, the clock had started. Meanwhile, Claire Weller Madsen was living what most would call a peaceful life. She had left teaching and now worked in the administrative office at the local community college. Her husband, Evan, was running a small remodeling business. They had no children together, but Evan's teenage son from a previous relationship lived with them on weekends. Their house was modest, a split level on Cedar Drive, less than 5 miles from where Claire had once lived with Daniel. She never mentioned Daniel. Not to Evan, not to friends. It was like she had erased that part of her life, boxed it up, and locked it away. But the truth was, she checked the parole board schedule every year. She knew the earliest Daniel could get out. She marked it in her calendar every January, though she told no one. When the date passed without incident, she exhaled. Maybe he'd moved on. Maybe prison had changed him. Maybe 20 years had buried his rage. But Daniel hadn't forgotten the halfway house on Grant Avenue wasn't much more than a run-down brick building with flickering hallway lights and beds that creaked with every breath. Daniel kept his space neat. He rose early, swept the floor, shaved every day. The staff noted his discipline, his silence. He attended his parole meetings, applied for jobs, and nodded politely to counselors. But at night, when the house grew quiet, he stared at the wall with hollow eyes. In prison, Daniel had learned to wait. He read law books obsessively. He filed and refiled appeals. He studied Claire's testimony, memorized the words she used. He said I'd never leave him alive. He punched me, then grabbed me by the throat. He read it again and again, the phrasing, the tone, the tears. It played like a rehearsed monologue in his mind. He wrote letters he never sent, some calm, some furious. At one point in 2011, he had even drafted a confession just to see how it felt, but he never signed it. Now, 2 weeks out, he was already watching. He'd searched Claire's name online at a local library terminal, confirming her address through property records. She still lived in Northwood, still used her maiden name professionally, Claire Weller Madsen. He took note of the real estate listings, old newsletters, her name on a PTA board from years ago. He never asked himself if it was right or wrong. He didn't feel like a man bent on revenge. Not exactly. It was more about balance, closure, something unfinished. Meanwhile, Claire noticed an unfamiliar sedan parked across from the college parking lot 2 days in a row. She didn't think much of it at first. Faculty always had visitors. But on the third day, when she left work at 5:18 p.m., she felt watched. The driver didn't move. The engine was off. She walked a little faster. That night, she brought up the old parole date on her calendar again. Then she checked the news. No updates. She told herself she was being paranoid. But her hand hovered longer than usual over the lock on their front door. On a Thursday morning, Daniel took a bus to Northwood under the pretense of following up on a job lead. It was risky. His parole officer had warned him about returning to the town where the incident occurred, but Daniel rationalized it. He wasn't contacting Claire. He wasn't doing anything yet. He sat outside a cafe across the street from Claire's workplace for over an hour, sipping coffee he barely tasted. At 11:47 a.m., she stepped outside with 2 coworkers. He didn't recognize the women, but he instantly recognized Claire. Time had changed her. Her hair was shorter, dyed a deeper brown, her posture more guarded, but the way she squinted in the sunlight, it was the same. He leaned forward, but didn't approach, just watched. Claire laughed at something one of her colleagues said. It was a fleeting, effortless moment, but to Daniel it was jarring. That smile, so casual, so free. How could she look so at peace after everything she'd done? Back at home that evening, Claire double-checked the front door again. Evan noticed. "Everything all right?" he asked casually, holding a glass of wine. She hesitated, then smiled. Just tired. But the unease lingered. That night, she searched Daniel's name again. No new arrests, no parole violations, no news. It was the not knowing that unsettled her most. Daniel returned to the halfway house without incident. But something had shifted. Seeing her in person stirred emotions he hadn't expected. Confusion, grief, rage. And underneath it all, a strange sort of yearning. For justice, yes, but also for answers, for a truth that still eluded him. Did she really lie? Did he forget something? Later that night, he wrote her a letter. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't angry. It was disorienting, disjointed, a mix of questions and accusations, remorse and resentment. He didn't sign it. He folded it neatly and slipped it into an envelope. But he didn't mail it. Not yet. Claire didn't tell Evan about the past. Not the real past. He knew Daniel had been her ex-husband. He even knew there'd been an incident. But she had always described it vaguely. It was abusive, she once said over a bottle of wine early in their relationship. It ended badly. That was all. Evan never pressed. Now, sitting across from him at the dinner table, watching him scroll through news on his phone, Claire hesitated. She thought about the letter she once received in prison from Daniel's mother. It was just after the trial. The letter was short, just a few lines. He said he didn't do it, but I also don't know anymore. I hope you find peace. I'm sorry for everything. Claire had torn it up and never spoke of it again. That night, she stood in the bathroom longer than usual, studying her own reflection. She wondered how much of what she remembered was real, and how much she'd forced herself to forget. Elsewhere, Daniel sat in the corner of a dimly lit room at the halfway house, staring at the unopened envelope still resting on the edge of his dresser. He hadn't been able to throw it away or send it. Instead, he'd started rewriting it. This version was calmer, but more pointed. He wanted her to read his words, to remember, maybe even to answer. It was the not knowing that consumed him, whether she had really been afraid that night, or whether she had just wanted out. He took a walk around the block to clear his head. Every time a car passed behind him, he tensed. Every interaction at the halfway house felt like surveillance. He couldn't sleep more than 3 hours a night. He hadn't spoken in full sentences to anyone in days. The next morning, Claire received a letter in the mail. No return address, neatly typed, no threats, just 3 pages. It began with, "You said I tried to kill you. I remember the wall, the yelling, but I don't remember my hands on you. So which of us is lying?" She dropped it on the floor as if it had burned her skin. Claire folded the letter and stuffed it deep inside her purse. She didn't throw it away, but she couldn't bear to look at it again. That night, she took a sleeping pill for the first time in months. her heart pounding as she lay beside Evan, who drifted off easily, unaware. At breakfast, she found herself staring at her husband too long. Evan was decent, loyal, steady, but he didn't know her past. Not truly. She had left out the uglier details, the ones that might have made her seem less like a victim and more like someone complicit in a toxic, spiraling marriage. She had loved Daniel once fiercely, destructively. That part never made it into her courtroom testimony. At work, she avoided checking her mailbox. When her assistant handed her a small stack of interdepartmental envelopes, she flinched. By mid-afternoon, she made a decision. She opened her office drawer and placed the letter inside a file labeled personal. Then she locked it. That same morning, Daniel met with his parole officer, Leonard Briggs. Briggs, a weary, sharp-eyed man who'd handled hundreds of cases, studied Daniel's quiet compliance with suspicion. "You're not doing anything stupid, right?" he asked, after reviewing the monthly report. Daniel offered a thin smile. "No, sir, following all the rules." Briggs stared for a second longer than necessary. "You know the terms. No contact means no contact, even indirect." Daniel didn't respond. Back at the halfway house, Daniel logged into a public-use computer. He searched the Pennsylvania court system's archive, reviewing his case docket, the old trial transcript, and every hearing that followed. In his cell folder, he had made notes on inconsistencies, statements that didn't line up, things Claire said that the EMTs didn't confirm a line from the 911 transcript haunted him. "He's yelling, but he's not touching me yet." Yet. He zeroed in on that word. His mind latched onto it, feeding a narrative that perhaps even Claire hadn't meant to construct. Was she scared of what he might do, or reporting something that hadn't happened yet? Daniel printed out a copy of the transcript and highlighted the sentence. Then he stared at the paper for nearly an hour, lips moving as he whispered to himself. That night he wrote another letter, shorter, sharper. One line stood alone on the page. "You said I hadn't touched you yet, so why did I get 20 years? Claire sat in her car outside the college parking lot, her fingers wrapped around the steering wheel long after the engine shut off. She hadn't told anyone about the second letter. She thought about calling the police, but what would she say? There was no name, no fingerprints, no direct threat. And the longer she waited, the harder it became to admit how long she had been hiding it, especially from Evan. That night at home, Evan brought up a weekend trip, something simple, maybe to the mountains. Claire forced a smile. Sounds great. But her mind was 100 miles away. She knew she should tell him. She just didn't know how to start. Back in Allegheny, Daniel grew bolder. He took another bus to Northwood. No job application excuse this time. He walked past Claire's house just once. He didn't stop, didn't approach, just walked. But in his mind, he was tracing the walls of his old life. He could still remember the layout of the kitchen, the tilt of the front porch steps, the spot where she had stood during their last argument. He bought a disposable phone at a gas station that afternoon. He didn't activate it, not yet, but holding it made something feel possible. At the halfway house, he skipped group counseling again. One of the residents, a wiry man named Joel, made a casual comment in the common room. "You're always in your head, man. You ever talk to anybody?" Daniel stared at him for a long moment. "Not if I can help it." The next morning, Daniel printed out another portion of Claire's trial testimony, her cross-examination. He read it aloud in his room, mimicking the tone of her voice as best he could, over and over. "I was afraid for my life," she had said. "He said if I ever left him, he'd ruin me." He paused. He didn't remember saying that. Not those words. But what if he had? Something in him split. The part that wanted to believe he was framed, and the part that wondered if there were things he'd buried so deep even he couldn't retrieve them. At 3 a.m., he typed a new letter. It ended with, "Do you still believe I would have ruined you? Or do you think you ruined me?" He sealed it, addressed it, and placed it under the bed. This time, he planned to deliver it in person. It was a Saturday when Daniel returned to Northwood again. This time, there was no pacing across the street, no idle watching. He took the letter, now sealed in a plain white envelope, and walked straight down Cedar Drive, Claire's street. He wore a gray hoodie, hood up, head down. There were children playing in a nearby yard, a neighbor washing his car, dogs barking faintly in the distance. He kept walking. His steps slowed as he approached the house. Claire's car was in the driveway. Evan's truck, too. Daniel's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of proximity. He had dreamed about this house for years, the stairs, the porch light, the glass pane above the door. He had memorized its blueprint in his mind. Now, standing just feet from it, he was paralyzed. He didn't knock. Instead, he slid the letter through the mail slot, turned, and walked away without looking back. Inside, Claire was upstairs folding laundry when she heard the faint rustle. She froze. For a second, she hoped it was junk mail. She hoped it was anything else. But when she went downstairs and saw the envelope lying inside the door, she knew. This was different. There was no postmark, no stamp, no attempt to hide the delivery. Hands trembling, she picked it up, opened it. "Do you still believe I would have ruined you? Or do you think you ruined me?" It wasn't just a letter. It was proof. It was contact, direct, a parole violation. She sat down at the kitchen table, letter in hand, as Evan came in from the backyard. He saw her face. "Claire, what is it?" This time she couldn't lie. She handed him the letter in silence. Evan read it once, then again, jaw tightening. "What the hell is this?" Her eyes welled. "He's out. He's been out since January. He's been writing me." Evan stared at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I thought it would stop. I didn't want to drag you into it." He picked up his phone. "We're calling the police. Now." Parole Officer Leonard Briggs received the call at 9:42 a.m. Monday morning. It came from Northwood Police, relaying a report made the night before. A former inmate, Daniel Weller, had made prohibited contact with his ex-wife. The officer on the line didn't mince words. "There's a typed letter, delivered to her home. She gave us the envelope." Briggs went still. "She's absolutely certain it came from him?" "She says he's been sending others. This is the first she's turned in. Says this one was different. Personal delivery." Briggs exhaled slowly. "I'll handle it." Within the hour, he was at the halfway house. Daniel was sitting alone in the back lounge, leafing through a worn paperback copy of Crime and Punishment. When Briggs walked in, Daniel didn't look up. "Room, now," Briggs said. Inside the small, bare room, Briggs stood with his arms crossed. "You've been in Northwood?" Daniel shrugged. "Not officially." "You sent a letter to Claire Weller." No answer. "Don't lie. We have the envelope. Typed. No stamp. Dropped through her door. She gave it to the police." Daniel looked down. "She read it then." Briggs blinked. "You just admitted it. That's a violation, Weller. That's prison again." Daniel's voice was calm. "I didn't hurt her. I just wanted her to tell the truth." Briggs stared at him. "You've got one option. We go in, we report this, and you go back to court. Or you cooperate now. Voluntary detainment until your parole hearing." Daniel smirked slightly. "So you're giving me a choice?" Briggs stepped closer. "No, I'm giving you the illusion of one." By that evening, Daniel was removed from the halfway house and placed in temporary custody at the Allegheny County holding facility. He didn't resist. He barely spoke. When asked if he understood his violation, he simply said, "She started it." At home, Claire sat with Evan, her hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. She felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. Guilt for not speaking sooner. Relief that something, anything, was finally happening. But she also knew something Daniel hadn't said yet. He knew where she lived, and even if he went back to prison, he had already been inside her house in every way that mattered. The detention facility in Allegheny was a far cry from Green State, but Daniel recognized the rhythm instantly. The metal clanks of doors, the dim lights that never quite shut off, the cold, echoing silence of institutional space. He hadn't spoken to anyone since intake. He ate his meals, answered when addressed, and otherwise kept his eyes low. But in his head, the monologue never stopped. He replayed the delivery again and again. The softness of the envelope, the click of the mail slot, the way the air shifted as he turned and walked down the driveway. The part that stuck with him most wasn't fear or regret. It was the fact that she had read it. She had touched it. His words, after years of silence, had finally landed in her hands, and she gave them away. He'd always expected that might happen, but the betrayal of it, it felt like a second trial. She hadn't responded, not once, not directly. No letter, no call, only silence until it served her. On the outside, Claire sat in the police station's interview room once again. Older, more composed than the last time she'd spoken to law enforcement about Daniel Weller. She gave a full statement this time. She turned in every letter she had received. The officer wrote in silence, letting her speak. Claire's voice wavered only once. When describing the moment, she picked up the envelope at her front door. "It wasn't the words," she said. "It was knowing he'd been there, that he was still looking at me the way he used to, not like a person, like a question he wanted answered." Evan sat beside her, silent, his jaw tense, fists clenched in his lap. Later that evening, they filed for a protective order, a formal restraining directive to be added to the parole board's review. Meanwhile, Leonard Briggs prepared his parole violation report. He added every detail, the timeline, the physical evidence, Claire's testimony. It would be reviewed by a 3-person panel. If they ruled against Daniel, he would serve the remainder of his original 20-year sentence, 5 more years without parole eligibility. But even Briggs felt unsettled. Daniel wasn't lashing out. He wasn't threatening. He was methodical, cold. That kind of silence, Briggs knew, didn't mean surrender. It meant planning. The parole hearing was set for 2 weeks after Daniel's detainment. Claire and Evan were both notified and asked to prepare victim statements. The prosecutor handling the case advised them that their presence wasn't mandatory. The evidence was strong, the violation clear, but Claire insisted on attending. Evan wasn't so sure. "You don't have to look at him again," he said, gently, on the drive there. Claire nodded but said nothing. She knew she wouldn't speak during the hearing, only submit a written statement. But the thought of not showing up made her feel complicit, as if silence had already failed her once, and she refused to repeat the mistake. Inside the small hearing room, the panel sat at a long table. 3 members, mid-level bureaucrats, stone-faced. Leonard Briggs stood beside them with his report in hand. Daniel, seated alone at the table's opposite end, wore a faded jumpsuit. He looked older than he had just months ago, the shadows under his eyes deeper, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak unless asked. When questioned about his intentions in delivering the letter, he replied, "I wasn't threatening her. I just wanted clarity." One panel member leaned forward. "Do you understand that your version of clarity is irrelevant to the legal terms of your parole?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Claire sat in the back row. From that distance, she could see his profile but not his eyes. She stared anyway, waiting for some flicker of guilt, of regret, but he gave her nothing. He didn't glance her way. He didn't flinch when her written statement was read aloud. In it, she wrote, "I live with the knowledge that he never stopped watching me, that he was not rehabilitated, only patient." Briggs handed over the final police report, including time-stamped photos of the letter in Claire's home. The panel recessed briefly, then returned with a verdict. Parole revoked. Daniel was to be returned to state prison to serve the remaining 5 years of his original sentence without eligibility for early release. Outside the courthouse, Evan exhaled sharply. "It's over," he said. Claire didn't answer, because in her gut she didn't feel closure, only a reprieve. Inside the van, returning him to Green State, Daniel leaned against the cold metal wall and whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, "5 years is nothing." Life after the hearing settled into a strange new rhythm for Claire and Evan. The sense of danger had been replaced by something quieter, but just as haunting. An awareness. Claire checked the locks twice at night, kept her phone beside the bed, and took alternate routes home without fully realizing it. Daniel was behind bars again, but he had been there once before, and it hadn't stopped him. Evan tried to be supportive, but cracks began to form. He started coming home later from work, staying up watching TV after Claire had gone to bed. When she asked him about it, he shrugged. Just thinking. He didn't say it aloud, but the weight of being a protector was taking a toll, especially against an enemy that the law couldn't promise to neutralize forever. One night, Claire found herself alone in the kitchen, rereading the letters she had turned over to the police. The station had scanned them into evidence and allowed her to retrieve the originals. She kept them in a locked drawer, but couldn't help herself. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was curiosity. Each letter had its own tone, confused, poetic, accusing. None made outright threats, but beneath the language was a cold logic. Daniel was building a narrative in which he was the wronged party. A man denied truth, denied justice. Meanwhile, inside Green State, Daniel resumed his old patterns quickly. He kept to himself, rejoined no programs, spoke little, but he watched. He took note of other inmates, particularly one, a younger man named Harris Kane. Kane had a release date set for the following year, and a reputation for finding ways to get things in and out of the prison. One afternoon in the yard, Daniel struck up a conversation. It was casual, about weather, food, court stories. But slowly, over days, Daniel began asking questions. Hypotheticals. You ever reach out to someone on the outside without using your name? Or, you ever have something you wanted to say to someone but couldn't put your name on it? Kane didn't ask many questions. He just nodded. He was used to men who needed something. A few weeks later, Daniel handed Kane a note, folded tight and sealed with tape. "Just send it," he said. "No name, no threat, just a message." Kane took the note and walked away without a word. Claire received the envelope on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped between utility bills and a real estate flyer. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sloppy, juvenile, but something about it stopped her cold before she even opened it. No return address, no stamp either. It had been dropped off in person. She waited until Evan got home before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. Typed in a font Daniel had used in previous letters, neat, measured, center-aligned, was one line. When the truth doesn't come out on its own, sometimes it has to be dug up. There was no signature, no date. Claire dropped the letter on the kitchen counter and stepped back as if it were a lit fuse. Evan read it, brow furrowing. "He's writing again?" "He can't," Claire whispered. "Not legally, not directly." They both knew what that meant. Someone else was helping him. Evan's calm cracked. "This is enough. We go back to the police, today." Claire hesitated. "They'll ask how it got here. We don't know. It wasn't mailed." Evan grabbed his keys. "Then we make them find out." Back in Green State, Daniel said nothing to Kane for days. He didn't have to. The message had been sent. Whether Claire received it or not, that wasn't the point. The point was control. The point was presence. Kane didn't ask questions, didn't expect thanks. He had done his part and now kept his distance. But he had noticed something strange in Daniel. Not aggression, not even anger. Something colder. A man waiting for something inevitable. Daniel's cellmate, an older lifer named Grafton, finally asked him outright, "What do you get out of this? She's out there living her life. You're in here. You think another letter's going to change that?" Daniel didn't look up from his notebook. It already has. At the Northwood Police Department, Claire and Evan met with a detective who took the letter seriously. They started surveillance on their property, installed a camera facing the front porch, and reactivated the GPS data from Claire's vehicle. But the damage had already been done. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She dreamt of shovels, of digging through hard soil, of finding something buried beneath her own house. She woke up shaking, sweat-soaked, as Evan quietly pretended to sleep beside her. The Northwood police launched a formal inquiry into the anonymous letter, but it was already a cold trail. No fingerprints on the envelope, no witnesses on the street. The home surveillance camera had been installed just 2 days too late. The detective assigned to the case requested a full list of Daniel's known prison associates, and Harris Kane's name surfaced quickly. But Kane had been released on parole 3 days after the letter arrived. That detail rattled Claire more than anything else. "He sent someone out before the hearing even ended," she said softly, the realization sinking in. "He planned it in advance." Evan sat across from her, tense, jaw clenched. "He's manipulating the system again, hiding behind it." That evening, Claire received an alert from her bank. A charge had been made using an old credit card, one that hadn't been used in over 2 years. The delivery address matched their former house. It was a minor purchase, a gardening tool set from an online retailer, but it was enough to make her breath catch in her throat. "Digging," she whispered. The police were notified again. The account was shut down, and the order was intercepted in transit. But it felt less like a threat and more like a riddle. Daniel wasn't trying to reach her. He was toying with her, hinting at something buried, something unresolved. Back in Green State, Daniel spent long hours in the library, not reading, just sitting. He no longer talked to Kane. He didn't need to. The young man had done his part. Now Daniel observed others, listened, calculated. He asked to speak with a prison chaplain, not for confession, but under the guise of seeking peace. The chaplain, an older man named Donovan, agreed to meet weekly. Daniel didn't talk much, but when he did, it was philosophical. "People think forgiveness is about forgetting," Daniel said in one session. "But it's not. It's about forcing the other person to remember." Donovan made a note. "Forgiveness can't come from a place of control." Daniel smiled. "I'm not interested in forgiveness." Meanwhile, Claire began looking into Daniel's trial transcripts again, something she hadn't done in years. She reread her own statements, compared them to police photos. Her memory, once so firm, now felt uneven. A detail jumped out. The night of the assault, a neighbor had called 911 about shouting. Not her. Claire had never questioned the timing before. But the timestamp on the neighbor's call was before she made hers. It was only by 5 minutes, but enough to suggest something else had been happening, something she hadn't fully admitted, even to herself. The detective assigned to Claire's case finally tracked Harris Kane to a small apartment in a nearby town. He'd been out for 3 weeks. When approached, Kane didn't run, but he didn't offer much either. "I don't know who wrote the letter," he said. "I was just asked to drop it off. No crime in delivering mail." Pressed further, he repeated, "There was no name on it. Could have been anyone." Technically, it wasn't enough to charge him. Not without physical evidence linking him to Daniel. Still, the visit was logged. His name stayed on file. But Kane, like many who passed through prison doors, vanished into the haze of post-release life. Back in Northwood, Claire stood in the backyard of the home she had once shared with Daniel. They had moved away years ago, sold the property to another family. But when Evan saw her staring at the listing online, she confessed what was gnawing at her. "There's something back there, I know it now, I just don't know what." They drove out late, parked down the street. Claire hadn't stepped onto that lawn in 15 years. The new owners weren't home, or if they were, the lights were off. She and Evan crept through the gate and stood in the grass, near the edge of the old garden where they used to plant tomatoes in the spring. Claire stared at the dirt. "He said something once, during a fight. Said I'd bury myself if I ever turned on him. I thought it was just a threat." Evan looked down. "You think he meant this literally?" "I don't know," she whispered. "But I remember coming out here after the fight. I was shaking, and I dropped something. I don't remember what. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." They didn't dig, not yet. But Claire snapped photos of the yard, the angle of the fence, the tree line. The next day, she gave them to the police. A warrant was filed under quiet grounds. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in the chapel again, alone this time. He hadn't requested a session. He just sat in the pews, staring at the stained glass. When Chaplain Donovan eventually approached, Daniel said softly, "There's a moment when someone stops remembering and starts inventing. She's almost there." Donovan frowned. "She?" Daniel's lips curled. "She'll find it soon." 2 days after the police obtained the warrant, officers arrived discreetly at Claire's former home. The current owners had agreed to cooperate under condition of privacy. An unmarked van pulled up just after sunrise, and crime scene techs began scanning the backyard with ground-penetrating radar. Claire and Evan waited across the street, sitting silently in their parked car. Claire's hands were clenched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the old fence. "I don't even know what I'm hoping they find," she whispered. Evan didn't respond. He wasn't sure either. An hour later, one of the officers waved the team over. Something had appeared beneath the soil, rectangular, shallow, and old. A second officer called it in, and the area was marked off. 2 detectives began carefully digging, while a third reviewed the property records. At 11:30, they uncovered a small, rusted metal box. Inside was a man's wristwatch, cracked and dirty. A Polaroid photo, water-stained, showed Daniel and Claire smiling on the back porch. A necklace that didn't belong to Claire, and a torn piece of lined paper, folded over 3 times. The note read, "I told you she wouldn't believe herself." Claire stared at the evidence bag through the windshield, her face pale. "That necklace," she whispered. "It belonged to his sister. She died when we were together. He said he lost it." The detective returned to the car. "We'll have forensics look through everything, but there's no human remains. Just strange things. Intimate things." Evan looked at Claire. "Do you remember putting that box there?" "No," she said. "But I don't remember not doing it either." Back in Green State, Daniel sat in the corner of the rec yard, drawing faint lines in the dust with his finger. When asked later by his cellmate what he was doing, he simply said, "Teaching someone to question themselves is better than proving them wrong." That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She searched through old emails, voicemails, scraps of notes from that time. Nothing brought clarity. Instead, she felt a new kind of horror, not just fear of Daniel, but fear of herself. What if she hadn't remembered things accurately? What if Daniel's narrative, as grotesque as it was, had grains of truth? The detective returned a day later with the lab report. No fingerprints, no DNA. Nothing tied the box conclusively to Daniel, or to anyone. "He buried it to unsettle you," the detective said. "Not to hide something, to make you doubt your past." Claire nodded slowly. And it worked. Claire sat across from her therapist, staring at a spot on the wall just above the woman's shoulder. She had barely spoken in the first 15 minutes. When she finally did, it came out slowly, like letting go of a secret she wasn't sure belonged to her anymore. "What if I made it worse?" she said. "What if everything I said, everything I remembered, pushed him into what he became?" The therapist didn't answer immediately. It's natural to question yourself when someone has spent years trying to make you do exactly that. But what if I wasn't just wrong? What if I lied to myself back then? The silence between them was heavy, and it stretched far beyond the session. Later that evening, Evan came home to find Claire sitting in the dark. A pot of water had been left on the stove, forgotten. She looked up at him, her expression blank. "I don't trust my memory anymore," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. "You just have to trust that you're not crazy. He wants you to doubt yourself. Not because you're wrong, but because it makes you vulnerable." Claire didn't respond. Meanwhile, inside Green State, Daniel received a letter. It was from someone anonymous. No return name, just a city 3 states over. Inside was a photo, a copy of the police digging in Claire's yard, printed from a news leak. Below it, typed in small font, she looked terrified. Daniel folded it carefully and slid it under his mattress. He no longer needed to act. The echo of his influence had grown legs, arms, a life of its own, and if he waited long enough, he believed, it would all fall into place. That night, Claire found another envelope under her windshield wiper. No note this time, just a photograph. It was the same photo of her in the yard, mid-conversation with a detective, head slightly turned, expression unreadable. She dropped it immediately and stumbled back toward the house, shaking. This time, she didn't wait. She called the police. The responding officer asked all the right questions. Was anyone seen nearby? Any suspicious vehicles? Had anything else gone missing? But in the end, there were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and the surveillance camera had gone dark for 12 minutes due to a power surge. 12 minutes. 12 minutes when someone got close enough to put fear back in her veins. The next morning, Evan suggested they leave town, take a break, change the rhythm, start fresh. Claire didn't disagree, but as she packed a small suitcase, she found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror. Daniel hadn't killed her body. He hadn't needed to. He'd made her feel like a stranger to herself. Claire and Evan packed in silence. 2 suitcases, a locked box with the original letters, court documents, and photographs. Things they didn't want to leave behind. Evan had booked a rental house 5 hours north, under his name only. No forwarding address, no online posts, just escape. But escape, they both knew, was a concept more than a reality. As they loaded the car, Claire paused by the mailbox. It was empty. Still, she checked it twice. They left Northwood without saying goodbye to anyone. 3 days into the move, the cabin brought something like peace. No neighbors close by, no cell service in the deep woods. They cooked dinner together, read by the fireplace, slept through the night for the first time in weeks. On the 4th morning, Claire opened the door to find a small package on the porch. There was no address, no name, just a flat brown box, the size of a hardback book. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a second copy of the photograph of her in the garden, the same one she'd received on her windshield. Except this version was marked. A thin red line circled her hand, where she had been gripping her phone. On the back was one sentence, printed neatly. "If they can't find the truth, maybe you'll bring it to them." Claire stood frozen. Her first thought wasn't Daniel. It was someone else. Someone else had continued the mission. Or maybe Daniel had never been alone. Evan took the box, shaking with fury. "We have to call the police." "But what can they do?" Claire said. "They can't protect us from what's already in motion." In Green State, Daniel sat in the infirmary. His breathing had changed. A month ago, he had collapsed in his cell. Internal bleeding, they said. He was now confined to a medical bed, monitored, but no longer considered a threat. The chaplain visited him for what would be the last time. "You've lost everything," Donovan said quietly, "and yet you still believe you've won." Daniel, pale and gaunt, looked up with a smirk. "I don't need to win. I just needed her to carry the weight." "Why?" the chaplain asked. Daniel turned away. "Because I did, and it broke me." Daniel died 3 days later. No funeral, no visitors. But the fear he sowed didn't die with him. A week later, Claire received an email from a burner account. The subject line, "Loose ends," attached, a photo of Evan taken from across a parking lot. Recent. The police opened an investigation, but there was nothing to trace. Whoever was behind it had erased their trail. Claire knew then, this wasn't just Daniel's legacy. It was the reality he created. A narrative of control, of fractured memory, of terror stitched into the ordinary. And now someone else had picked it up.